Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is day 5 of Listen Up, the Power of Podcasting, Bulgaria's first podcast festival. Well, indeed, this is the last day of this event, and we are very grateful that you decided to spend your Sunday afternoon with you, or whatever time it is in the country that you are based in. This festival is organized by the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria and is kindly supported by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and America for Bulgaria Foundation. So far, during the previous 4 days, we've been talking about how to start a podcast. We heard some very inspirational stories, how to tell captivating audio narrative, etc. Today, though, we'll talk money. And this is, we saved this for the last day, but this is a very important issue. And we have two very skillful podcasters joining us today to share their experience with you. We have Katy Lee, the host of Europeans, an award-winning podcast with us today, and in a bit she will tell us how we can basically produce a sustainable podcast even though we might be an independent podcast producer. We also have Karolis Vishniauskas with us. He is the host and producer of Nara, one of the first podcasts in Lithuania. And he will tell us about how they managed to raise 50,000 euros on Patreon. That's quite impressive. I'm looking forward to hear the story, and basically convince Lithuanians to support audio journalism in the country. Just some housekeeping before we dive right into it. For those of you who need translation, click the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom menu and choose the Bulgarian channel. For those of you who want to share something about the festival on social media, you can use the hashtags Listen Up and Podcast Festival. At the end, we'll have some time for questions, so please use the Q&A section of this webinar. For those of you who are watching us on Facebook and on YouTube, use the comment sections and we can also ask your questions. Well, without further ado, Katy, please take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. Nice to be back. Just give me 1 second. I'm just sharing my screen with you. Okay. Cool. Well, yes. Let's talk about money. Filthy lucre. This stuff is like hard to talk about for a lot of people. So I think the main thing is not to be embarrassed to talk about money. We all need to make a living, and it's not fun to do projects forever unpaid, although certainly the Europeans was an unpaid project for really quite a long time. So that is something, I guess that's the first thing to bear in mind. This is it. This is the bottom line. Independent podcasting is unfortunately unlikely to make you a millionaire or a billionaire. So if that is your goal, maybe find a different hobby, do something else, because podcasting is not going to be it. There's got to be another reason why you're doing it. Maybe you have a message you want to share with the world, or just you want to spend some time being creative. But probably don't go into it for the money. That's not the best idea. Obviously, there have been recently some very high profile cases of people making a lot of money from the podcasting industry, right? And I think a lot of us who are interested in audio see these headlines and think, oh, this is what does this mean for us? I think the answer to that is probably nothing, unfortunately. Most of us are not Joe Rogan. We are not going to get paid tens of millions of dollars or euros to make podcasts. So that is sadly not going to be a reality for all of us, even though there is more money in the podcasting industry than there was, say, 5 years ago, even. There is a lot more money floating around, which is an interesting development. I'm going to talk to you about a few different things over the next sort of 20 or so minutes, because I don't want you to go away with the message that there is nothing you can do. It is hopeless. I am going to be a poor, starving podcaster forever, there are still things you can do to make money out of podcasting, especially if you're serious about building an audience. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we monetize the Europeans, which remains a very small independent podcast, but we've made enough money to keep it going, or at least enough to keep us wanting to keep making it. So as part of that sort of general monetization strategy, I'm going to talk to you about 3 different ways in which we have obtained some sort of revenue. We've used a kind of mixture at the Europeans. So we have some advertising on the show, not every week. It's very irregular, our advertising. But we do have advertising on the show, and I'll talk to you a little bit about different strategies you might find to get in touch with advertisers, to find advertisers for your podcast, or maybe setting up something a little bit more constant to have advertising every single week. If you have a bigger audience, I think that is definitely a possibility. Carolis is going to talk obviously a lot more about Patreon next. So I'm only going to talk a little bit about listener support, but that is a part of the European story. So I'll talk a little bit about how we have also used Patreon to generate some income for ourselves. And the third main revenue stream for us has been grant funding, which has been quite important for us in terms of being able to do things that are a little bit more ambitious. So I will start with advertising. I guess maybe it's easiest if I start with the big boys in the industry. So a lot of you might listen to, I don't even know, any sort of big, major, and especially American podcast that you listen to. You might hear these little ad breaks, right? And then you will hear generic adverts for things like cars, Squarespace, websites, like all of these different companies. And you can hear very clearly that there's a gap in the podcast, and an advert has been slotted into this little gap in between the 2 breaks in the podcast. And this is something that we call dynamic insertion. So there's a whole sort of ecosystem built around podcast advertising, and there's companies like Acast. Acast is probably the best known type of company that does this, but there are a few others. There are these companies that basically they can insert adverts into your podcast. So they just say, we will sort out the whole thing. Don't worry about it. We will take care of finding advertising for your podcast. In exchange for us providing that lovely service for you, we are going to take a percentage of the money that is generated from that advertising. Okay, so this is something that you will hear a lot on fairly prominent podcasts. The thing is, they generally only work with podcasts of sort of 10,000 downloads or so an episode. It's really the sort of bigger audiences that they're looking for, because obviously they work mostly with big companies who are going to want to say, okay, I'm looking to get my advert in front of 50,000 pairs of ears this week, so I need a big audience. So if you are a very, very small independent podcast, that is perhaps not the best option for you. But that doesn't mean that advertising is not an option for you at all. It definitely is. You can, of course, find advertising yourself for your podcast, right? If you have an audience that perhaps is interested in some kind of specialist area, for example, you might think, okay, I have this audience, maybe it's pretty small. It might only be a few thousand or even a few hundred, if you want to go really micro, a few hundred listens per episode. There might still be, depending on what the content is of my podcast and what the audience is, there might still be somebody who would want to advertise on my podcast. So finding advertisers for yourself independently is totally an option. And you can certainly, work out who your audience is and then approach companies and institutions whose audience overlaps with your own. The thing you need to do, of course, for that is to work out who your audience are. So that's the big thing. And a lot of you will probably know already that you can use analytics from your host platform. So for example, the Europeans is hosted by Anchor, and Anchor give us data on where geographically our audience is. They also use Spotify data to tell us the age breakdown and gender breakdown of our audience. And this is all information that we can use to build up a demographic picture of who actually listens to our podcast. So we can go out to advertisers and say, hey, by the way, we have this many thousands of listeners a week. And of that, this percentage are aged under 35, for example, or, 15% of them are in Germany, whatever it is. These statistics, you can use them to build up a picture and of who your audience are, and actually use that to then go to companies or institutions and say, I think we'd be a really good match. I talked about this a little bit in I can't even remember which talk it is, because I've given a couple over the last few days at Listen Up, but there was one talk I was giving this week where I was talking about surveys. You might want to use a survey to sort of complement the analytic data that you get in terms of working out who listens to your podcast, because the analytics, they can be supremely interesting, but you have to take them with a pinch of salt, because firstly, you get limited data about who is listening. In our case, we use Spotify. So the data it's from Spotify, right? And I have a suspicion that the people that listen on Spotify are perhaps slightly younger than our average listener might be, for example. So the Europeans, we did a survey I think it was in February, listener survey, just asking listeners to tell us a little bit about who they are. And that allowed us to get a lot more sort of granular detail about our audience. And it was very, very interesting. So you can use those two together. This is the other thing. I mean, audience, if you have an established audience, potential advertisers might come to you. And this has certainly been the case for the Europeans. We have been very bad at seeking advertising over the past 3 years. We've done it actively, very little, actually. Both my co-host and I, we juggle the Europeans, producing the Europeans every week with very busy other jobs. And I have to say that finding advertisers has not been something that we have tried to do very actively. So most of the adverts that we have had, interestingly, have been people who've come to us. And this has happened as well with other podcasts that I've worked on. I did a little bit of production recently for a podcast that it is for writers. It is interviews with well-known novelists and people that write film scripts. So it's kind of like an educational podcast for writers. And some companies have contacted them and said, I think it was a dating website for people that love books. And the dating website came to them and said, this seems like a good match. Maybe we could advertise in your podcast. So this does happen, especially if you have been going for a while and you have a very established audience. The more people hear of you, the more likely potential advertisers are to come to you. So I'll just tell you a little bit about how we have done European advertising on the Europeans, which, as I say, is not very much because we've been very bad at it. But yeah, like I said, we did that classic thing where we tried to build a picture of who our audience are. So we did that with a combination of data from our hosting platform and Spotify. And then we combined that with a survey that we did in February. We used Iterate, which is a free survey website. It's pretty good. It looks very nice. It's very user-friendly. You can see a screenshot there. And that was really helpful in terms of working out the sort of gaps and getting more qualitative data as well about the kind of things that our audience are interested in. So, for example, we asked them about the kind of themes they were interested in, and it kind of confirmed our suspicions in a few ways in terms of things like, we had a lot of listeners saying, oh, I'm really interested in the climate and I really want to be more green in terms of my personal life. So this is useful information in itself because, if there was some sort of ethical product, environmentally friendly clothing or something, that, for example, might be a pretty good match for our audience. In terms of what we have worked out about our audience, we know that they are mostly young. You can see from the stats there, they're sort of mostly aged under 35, 34 and under. They come from all across Europe. We know that they are pretty educated, and we know that they like learning. Another thing that we were quite surprised about is that about a third of them are Americans. And that was, I guess, just because, America has such a huge Anglophone podcasting audience. There are so many of them listening, and more Americans listen than perhaps we do here in Europe. In Europe, we're a little bit behind with the podcasting revolution. So we have, surprisingly, a lot of Americans who listen to our show. And when we ask them, why do you listen to our show? They say it's because there's a couple of different reasons. Either it's because they don't talk very much about Europe in the American news media. They don't get to hear about what's happening here very much. It's very dominated by domestic news. So this is their chance to catch up on what's happening on this side of the Atlantic. Or a lot of them, it's quite interesting. It's a lot of Americans that have, an Italian grandmother or a Polish grandpa or something like this. So it's them trying to stay in touch with this European heritage that they have, which is quite nice. So armed with all of this information, we have tried to match ourselves with advertisers that overlap with those audiences. As I say, we haven't done a lot of that very proactively. A lot of the time it's been companies coming to us. But just to give you a few examples of the kind of companies that have come to us, very early on in the show, we ran a series of adverts with a shipping company, an American shipping company that works a lot with US expats who are living in Europe. So that was, again, quite a good match, a good audience for us. We did a small campaign with Live Europe, who are a concert venue chain. They have concert venues in lots of different cities, Lisbon and Barcelona and all of these different cities. So that, again, is quite good for us because our audience is pretty young. They like going out and listening to live music normally when there's not a pandemic on. So these were like pretty good matches for us. And it worked out pretty well. I just want to give you an example of an advertisement that has run on the Europeans. In broad terms, there's a couple of sort of big types of adverts that you might think about slotting into your podcast. So one is just an advert that is read by somebody else. It's pre-produced. And we had an example of this fairly recently. There was a new podcast about sort of a European arts festival that wanted to advertise on our show. And they said, we have made a trailer. Can we please pay you to run this trailer for our podcast in the middle of your podcast? So that's what we did for them. The other sort of main option in terms of the type of podcast advertising that you might hear is something that is read by the host. And host-read adverts, I think it's quite important to note, you generally charge the advertiser a little bit more for something that is read by you. And that, I think, is because to some extent, if you get the hosts to read it, it sounds like a personal endorsement, right? And as I've said before, at this festival, I think people have this quite intimate relationship with their favorite podcast hosts. There's a trust there. So if your favorite podcast host is saying, buy this mattress, it's an incredible mattress, you're probably going to trust them. So, obviously you as the podcaster, you should think very seriously before you advertise some product. If it is complete junk, that is probably not a good idea, no matter how much you want the money. But if it is a product that you can get behind or an event that you can get behind, that I think is a good opportunity to do a host read. And I just want to play you here an advert that we ran, I think it was the week before last. We ran an advert for an event called Europe Talks, which is this big sort of online conversation where it's run by Die Zeit newspaper in Germany. And what they do is it's kind of like speed dating. They match up people from all over Europe to have a conversation this year online. I think previously it's been in real life. And you just go on Skype with this random stranger from a different European country who has different opinions than you, and you come together and talk about politics and try and have a dialogue of some kind. And we were big fans of this project. We think it's really nice. So we were very happy to do a host read advert, right? There was no ethical conflict where we're like, oh God, this is a terrible country that is, company that is involved in deforestation. And we just thought it was like a nice project that deserved to have a little bit more amplification and more publicity. So we were very happy to advertise it. So I'll just play it for you now. It's very short.
This week's podcast is sponsored by Europe Talks, which is a brilliant event that you took part in last year, Dominic. So I'm just going to sit back, relax, and let you tell us all about it.
So lazy. But yes, Europe Talks is a really fun initiative where you get matched up with someone who has different opinions and who lives in a different country. And you ring them up and have a conversation about everything, really, about politics, climate change, whatever you want. And last year they matched me up with a woman from Belgium and we had a really nice conversation, although we realised that we actually agreed on most things. But I guess that's also nice.
Maybe that's because you managed to convince her because you're so amazing and clever.
I don't think so.
After a year of social distancing and general insanity, we think this is a really nice effort to bring Europeans together to talk about the stuff that matters. So we will both be signing up and we recommend that you do too.
Who knows, you might even get matched with me or Katy.
Thousands of Europeans are going to be taking part on December the 13th, and the more people who sign up, the more interesting conversations can take place between random people across the continent. Just search for Europe Talks or click on the link in the show notes.
So there you are. You can hear that it's said in our voices. It sounds kind of how we normally talk, although maybe it's slightly different. But that's an example of a host read ad. And I would stress once again, do make sure if you are going to do a host read ad on your podcast that it is something that you actually believe in, or if it is a product, it is something that you have tested and actually like, and not just, a mattress from the internet. Some other options that you might want to think about in terms of formats for advertising are perhaps a sponsored segment on your podcast. Maybe it is, if you have a regular interview, it could just be the interview that is every week. It's like the interview segment is sponsored by this company, or perhaps sponsored interview guest slots. That's another option that a lot of people use. It's kind of a tricky one because there's an overlap between the editorial decisions and money, unfortunately. But that's a discussion that you can certainly have if the opportunity arises. I need to speed up a little bit. I've just realized. So I'm going to just push through a little bit. In terms of thinking about pricing for your advertising, a big concept to bear in mind is CPM, cost per meal or cost per thousands. And this is basically the cost of the ad per 1,000 plays that it's going to be. And in terms of sort of industry averages internationally, or perhaps more in the US, you're looking at about $18 for a 30-second ad, or $25 for a 60-second ad. If it's longer, I think you can push it up a bit. And I think something that you can really bear in mind, especially if you are a small independent podcast, is that if you have a niche audience, then you can maybe charge more because those listeners are more likely to buy whatever product it is, right? So if it is a fishing podcast and you run an advert for fishing products, I don't know, nets, hooks, whatever, you might be more likely to actually get people to go on that website. So that's a very good match. And I think you can charge more than the sort of industry average CPM. One website I wanted to make a quick reference to is Podcorn, which is a new-ish website. We haven't used it, but I think it is quite interesting and something that some of you might want to check out at some point. It's basically a website that matches advertisers to podcasts. And there are basically, there's a long list of companies that say, hello, I'm looking to advertise on a podcast that has a, I don't know, mostly young female American audience or whatever it is. So you can have a look down there and then you can actually make pitches to these companies and say, hello, I have that audience. This is my podcast. Would you like to advertise with us? And then they, again, sort of like similarly to Acast, they would take a percentage of the revenues from that. Talking briefly about listener support, which is, of course, what Carolus is going to focus on. There's a few different options. So both Carolus and us at the Europeans, we've all used Patreon, which is the biggest of this kind of website, where you can basically collect micro donations or even macro donations if people are feeling generous, but donations from your listeners so that they can help support the show. I think it is important to note that Patreon is not the only option. There's been a couple of different ones arising in recent years. Steady, they're based in Berlin. And I think, at least until recently, they were offering a slightly higher percentage to you as the creator than Patreon was. So if you are based in Europe, that's definitely an option to check out. Coffee, again, does something pretty similar. It's all about collecting these little tiny donations. And that is something that we have been doing at the Europeans for about, I want to say 2 years. I'm not quite sure because time is blending at the moment. But we set it up. We regret not setting it up earlier, actually. We were a little bit reluctant to do it because we thought, I don't know, there was just some weird masochistic thing in us that said, oh, we should just be doing this for free. And people wouldn't pay. People wouldn't pay to help us make this. It turns out we were completely wrong about that. People are very nice and very generous. And if they enjoy a project, often they want to help you keep being able to make it. You would be very surprised at how many people will help you, finance your project if it's something that they enjoy. Oops. In terms of rewards for your supporters, so this is the thing. It's the standard practice on Patreon to offer people things if they help support you. Often this is in the form of, getting every podcast a day early, for example. Via Patreon itself, you can upload audio files, and that way the people who support you can hear it a day early. That's a very common one. Often extra bonus content. This is a very common thing to offer your supporters for sort of super fans of the project. We at the Europeans, we offer ad-free versions of our episodes. Some people offer merchandise, personal messages. This is something actually that's been very popular at the Europeans, these personal messages. So for people who give us $5 or €5 a month, we send them, after they've pledged to support us, that we send them little voice messages. And people really like it because it's like their favorite podcast is talking to them like magic. And that's a really nice thing. Something I wanted to stress is that most people are supporting you because they're really, really nice people and not because they want stuff. Of course, you should give people the stuff that you have promised them, but that's not why they're there. They're there because they're amazing people. The other thing I think you should bear in mind is that if you are going to offer bonus content, that stuff takes a lot of extra time. I have a friend who is the co-host of an Irish podcast called The Irish Passport. Perhaps some of you have heard of it. And they do a lot of extra bonus content and they take it very seriously, but it basically almost doubles the work that they have to do. Finally, just talking a little bit about the third type of money revenue stream that we've had at the Europeans. Grant funding and prize money has been hugely, hugely important to us at the Europeans in terms of making us able to carry on doing this. As I said, we started off doing this for free. We did it completely free for more than a year, apart from the odd advertisement here and there. And we didn't have Patreon at the time. So it really was a passion project. It was something we were doing out of love. The year before last, we won a really, really amazing prize, an EU prize called the Spinelli Prize. There is a picture of me looking a little bit crazy because I can't believe we just won 25,000 euros. But this money was hugely important for us. It has allowed to pay us part-time in 2020 while we grow the show and try to become financially sustainable. And that's been really, really important to us. So if there are prizes, this is not a prize for podcasts, by the way, the Spinelli Prize. It's a prize for projects that educate people about Europe, which of course we do in a roundabout way. And a lot of people like the way that we educate people without them knowing that they're being educated about Europe, because it's kind of fun. So that was a really important source of income for us. So I do recommend that you look for journalism prizes or prizes that relate to your podcast project in some way, community prizes, anything that you might be eligible for. Grant funding as well, similarly to the prize money, has been really, really helpful to us. Last year, we won an €18,500 grant from the European Cultural Foundation, which allowed us to make a couple of series, more narrative series. If you listen to our show, you'll know that it's very chatty most of the time, and it doesn't involve hours and hours and hours and hours of production time. I mean, it does, but not the sort of very fancy narrative journalism stuff, which takes a huge amount of time and money. So I'll just click on this link quickly and show you. We made 2 mini-series. This is one of them, where we did our first sort of original reporting and very intimate sound design and all of these fancy things. And this is something that we would not have been able to do if it was not for this grant that we were very generously given by the European Cultural Foundation. Just in terms of where you might look for grant funding, it does depend on the nature of the podcast and where you are. But in general, I would really recommend that people look into journalism grants that they might be eligible for. There's some great generous organizations giving out money to journalistic projects like the European Journalism Centre and the International Women's Media Fund, if you happen to be a female journalist. There are also grants for cultural projects, and very happily, podcasts often count as cultural projects. We, of course, got our grant from the European Cultural Foundation, and there's a lot of national culture bodies that you might be eligible for. In the Netherlands, there's the Prins Claus Fund. These kind of the funds are very good sources of funding if you think your podcast might qualify as a cultural project. In terms of where you might hear about funding opportunities, there's a few different places that I really recommend signing up for. Mostly email newsletters can be really, really helpful in getting information about where is giving out money. I really like, you can see to the side there, a screenshot of HackPack, which is a weekly newsletter. I think it's weekly. Yeah, it's weekly. And they divide it into sections. So there's like a global section, then Europe, Africa, etc. And the Europe section is also often very interesting and includes grant opportunities. So that's a really helpful thing to sign up for. HackPack. Hostwriter does something very similar. There's loads and loads of opportunities there, especially for grants and competitions. And then I would recommend signing up, in fact, for newsletters from grant-giving organizations. I'm thinking about places like the Robert Bosch Foundation, the European Cultural Foundation, the European Journalism Centre, all of these places do have money to give out to worthy projects, and your podcast may well be one of those worthy projects. So check it out. That is it for now. I'm sorry that went so quickly. So I'll just hand over to Carolus.
Yeah. Hi. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much, Katy. I'm real grateful for this festival that I was able to find out about your podcast. Actually, today when I was going to my office, I was listening to the Europeans episode about Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I loved how you take serious topics and make it more kind of relaxing, but also very informative. I love the kind of interaction between you and Dominic, the other host. So if anyone who is listening haven't listened to your podcast, I would recommend doing that. And thank you for the overview of how to fund your podcast. And I will be focusing only on Patreon side. I hope you can see him. Nope, just a second. I hope you can see my presentation. I see that now it's it's not working now. So I guess I'll have to stick to this not full screen option.
Carolus,
yes?
It was working before, so maybe try the full screen or.
Yeah, but when I change the slide, I guess the slide is not changing. That's okay. No worries about that. I will stick to this one. So yeah, why Patreon, first of all? Well, because Patreon is one of the first places where people who are creating their podcast, they want to go, because it's so easy to set up your account and it's really popular. More and more people are aware of how to use Patreon, and it really works. In our case, it did work. However, there are things to be aware of, and there are lessons to be learned. So we've been hosting our Patreon for 3 years, and I'm gonna share some of those lessons. So first of all, who are we? We are a group of freelance journalists and photographers, sound engineers who decided to work together in Lithuania, and our media collective's name is Nara. Here are some pictures from our work, and this is how all of us are looking in one. Actually, we don't have a picture where all of us are together, so we decided to take selfies. Currently, what we do, we produce a weekly podcast, which is focused on social and cultural issues in Lithuania and abroad. And since this September, we're also running a proper website where we have like photo stories, where we have video stories. We try to expand of making more than just a podcast. But podcast is like the main thing that we've been doing for these last 3 years. And currently we have almost 600 people who collectively are giving us almost $3,000 actually dollars per month at this point. And if you look at the whole statistics, you see that we have collected 55,000 euros from 910 listeners since September 2017. And the question is that a lot? My answer would be that it's not enough to sustain our organization, of course. If you put it like in other terms, it's like almost 50 euros per day. That's how much we got since the start of our Patreon. And sorry for kind of mixing dollars and euros here, because when we started our campaign, it was all in dollars, and at some point Patreon allowed to use euros, but we cannot. But some of the statistics are in different currencies. It's not enough to sustain all of those people's work that you've seen before. However, it's enough to show that people's perspectives are changing, because I know how it's in other countries. In a country like Lithuania, for the last almost like 20 years, we got used to the idea that that journalism is basically free, that journalists' work, you don't have to pay for it. That's just there for you to consume. And of course, the idea of free information, I loved it. And all of our work, it's available for everyone. There is no special Patreon content, but we believe that the idea that journalists' work have that you have to pay journalists to do their work, Patreon helps to change that attitude in Lithuanian society, and I guess in other countries it's quite similar. Okay, let's look at the global statistics for a second. If you see people, I will make this bigger. If you see who is getting money from Patreon in the whole like world setting, so there are people who get a lot of money from Patreon, and if you look at this this chart. One more. Yeah, so you see that 6 of top 10 earners on Patreon are people creating podcasts. Some of them are quite well known, like Chapo Trap House. Others are quite well news to me when I started to dig deeper into this. But there's definitely money here. For example, Chapo Trap House, they basically talk politics, US politics. They got $160,000 per month, and they are just few guys basically talking politics. However, it's important to understand that all of these podcasts are English language podcasts, and of course they have a huge audience. And if you are creating podcasts in your own language, like we are doing in Lithuanian language, well, there's like 3.5 million people in the world who speak this language. We have some episodes in English and Russian, but Lithuanian is like the main language. So the question is, can Patreon work for you if you are a European producer doing content in your own language? As I said, there are ways how to make Patreon work for you, but you have to understand certain things. So number one would be that it really takes time. For us to get the first $1,000 from our work, it took like 9 months, and if you want to reach 2,000, you have to wait for like two years almost. And in that time, we have already produced more than 100 episodes. So you have to constantly work and put a lot of effort, and your Patreon will rise, but it will rise not as fast as you would like it to be. However, Patreon is not only about money. I want to, for a second, stick to this slide. What I understood about Patreon is that it's really not a financial transaction, because those people, of course, people give you money and they want, and that's how it is in living in capitalist system. You need money to do stuff. However, what I realized that people, if they're willing to be your patrons, they are willing to help you in all other cases as well. So here is the picture of one of our interviewees. His name is Gytis Dudas, and he's a scientist working with viruses. And during the Ebola outbreak, he was one of the people leading the research. He was at a university in Seattle at that time, and his team was working, trying to understand how Ebola works and how to stop it. And I didn't know anything about existence of Gytis, even though he grew up in the same city that we are based in. And only when one of our patrons, who is herself a scientist, a Lithuanian living in the US, read in one magazine that the article by Gytis, she said, look, maybe this is a good interview for your podcast, because we're always looking for new people who are not well to Lithuanian audience, but can be interesting to them. So we contacted Gytis, we did the interview, and now his career is basically he has plans to move back to Lithuania and to continue his work here, because he has always wanted to do that, but he didn't really have any connections. And just because of this very first connection from our listeners, his view, a lot of other people found out about him. And when there was COVID outbreak, we did another episode with him and another scientist who is also our patron, and she's a scientist herself. And I know them because they're our patrons, but then they became our interviewees, and we are creating this kind of community there's a transition from being a patron to being someone who you interview. So it's all connected. It's not only about the money. Okay, moving on. It's important to understand that your patrons are based not only in your home country. Like in our case, only 70% of our listeners are based in Lithuania. Others are based in countries like UK or US or Germany. Basically, there are a lot of Lithuanians who are living in different parts of the world, and they tend to be more willing to give you money, and that's quite easy to understand why, because if like €5 in Germany means less than €5 in Lithuania because of the economical differences. And for example, this is the picture of what we did when we did the episode with our listeners. So there's one listener in US, one in Myanmar, one in Netherlands, and one in New Zealand. And so that's one of the ways to engage listeners, just to sometimes interview them instead of just producing content for them. Sometimes a Patreon leads you to really interesting people that you weren't aware that they even exist. Like one day we opened our inbox and we found that we have a new patron. That organization called Blossomwood Foundation gave us $100, and it means that they are giving $100 each month. And we thought, like, who are Blossomwood Foundation? We were suspicious in the beginning. Maybe we are being scammed here or something. And then we Googled it, and then I found this article by Washington Post that, it's an organization founded by two Lithuanians who emigrated to US, and they are helping during climate disasters. They're raising money, and they themselves go into different parts of the world to help people. And some of that money they decided to give to us, even though they have never contacted us before. We didn't know they exist. And at some point we tried to make contact with them. We met them at the airport at a short amount of time when they were in Lithuania. We took a picture together, and they said that we just like what you're doing, so we decided to help you a little bit. So I love that. However, there are limitations. It's important to understand that Patreon works best for younger and English-speaking listeners. For example, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, they would like to finance our work as well. However, when you go to Patreon, you realize that it's all in English, and so there's a language barrier. And another thing that is important to understand is that not all the money that you get from, that part of the money that your listeners will give you will go to Patreon itself, or also to taxes. So this is like a screenshot from my own from the creators that I support. So there's like always this almost $2 that I will give away, and those $8 that will reach the creators. So if you count all this money, it's like a few thousand euros that we won't get directly because of they go to taxes, or they will go to Patreon each year. So there are ways. I think it's important to show your listeners that Patreon is not the only way to support. And we have in our website this information in Lithuanian, English, and Russian, that you can do bank transfer. You can give us income tax donation. You can advertise in our space. You can be like sponsor of our space. So there's a lot of ways to support. And it's important to show that Patreon can be the main thing, and it's good. But I mean, it shouldn't be the only thing. And I hope I still have a few minutes, so I will go to other slides. It's important to understand that managing Patreon is a job. What Katy said before, that you can come up with really nice ideas of how to engage your your patrons, how to engage your listeners, but it takes time to do all of it. And sometimes even things that you didn't imagine that they're going to take time, they actually going to take a lot of time. For example, I just checked before my speech today that currently we have 110 people whose payments were declined this month. This is how it looks in reality. So there are different reasons why this happened. Maybe someone's card has expired and that person needs to find a new card to continue paying for that. So you have to contact each of those people separately and say that, look, maybe you can check your Patreon account. Maybe we are losing your money, and someone has to do that. I sometimes do it myself because I think I want to have this direct interaction with people, and I just ask them how are they, why did they decide to support us. But yeah, it takes time. So just if you think that it's just free money coming to your account, that's not really the case. And also you have to care for your listeners. Like, for example, this picture of me sending postcards from the different photos from our work, and the picture on the right is a one listener who just received one of our postcards. So we do that. We sometimes do live events where we meet with our listeners and with other people that we want to interview, and we have kind of these group conversations and record them for our podcast. Like, for example, this one is about what does it mean to be a migrant in Vilnius? Is it a friendly city for someone who is not Lithuanian? So of course we cannot do it now during the COVID. And we have a Facebook group for our Patreon supporters. So yeah, I think it's important to do all of that and just go into the end. What I love about Patreon is that it allows you to be independent in that sense that if you lose one patron, if you lose another, like in this case, you see this small decline during the May 2019. At that point, we lost one patron who gave us like $100 per month, but that's okay because we already have like 500 other people who are supporting. When there's so many people, you aren't really dependent on any single of them, and that none of them has enough power, financial power, to kind of tell you what to do, to kind of put pressure on you. And I love that it's so divided. And yeah, number 9 that of like these 10 ideas that I want to 10 lessons that I want to share is that we kind of need to change culture in a way for making Patreon more sustainable. For example, this is the screenshot from one of our listeners. She's supporting us, but she's also supporting 4 or 3 different other creators every month. And I'm supporting several creators, and I know that there are a lot of people who do that, and it's kind of become almost fashionable to do that because people understand that if previously it was like in Lithuanian context, it was fashionable to get stuff for free, like to illegally download a movie. It was seen to be like a smart thing to do. Something like, I don't know, Donald Trump said, like, it was smart for him to pay such a small amount of taxes, right? So in what we have in Lithuania now is that people understand it's actually smart to invest in other creators because they can give you back. So I love this change of culture, and I think it's important for creators to talk about that and to encourage that. But on the other hand, I think you can also kind of do nothing because if you're doing your main stuff really well, like in our case, if we produce a proper podcast every week, on Katy's case, if you have the good Europeans episode each week, maybe that's just enough. Maybe all of this extra effort, maybe it's not needed. Maybe people are going to support you anyway. That's one of the strategies as well. So maybe you can just stick to your main thing because Patreon takes time. That's also one of the things that you can do. So yeah, I guess that would be it from my side. And I guess we can have some time to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both to Katy and Karolis. For podcast creators, I'm sure both of your presentations were full of useful tips of how to monetize their podcast. And I'm sure people who are new to podcasting or thinking of starting a podcast were scribbling down notes. I just want to encourage people once again to post their questions in the Q&A section. In the meantime, I just wanted to ask you, well, Carolus, you talked about this change of culture of allowing people to support podcasts. And Katy, you said earlier that you were a bit surprised that actually people are willing to donate. Does this actually show us that people are if the product is well done and it's quality journalism, people are willing to support it?
Sorry, I think we were both staring at each other saying, who's going to talk first? I can go first. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I spent most of my youth living in an era of the internet where everything was expected to be free. And, journalism has really suffered over the past 15 years because of this assumption that people are not willing to pay for stuff because there are so many other free things that you can consume. Why would they pay for this? And I think in general, the attitudes towards paying for content that people enjoy have really changed, especially with the rise of services like Netflix and Spotify. People are starting to generally change their assumptions about whether they should be paying for this stuff or not. And as Carola said, it is even becoming fashionable to be able to say, oh, I support this person and that person because I really like what they do. It's become kind of cool to support projects. So that's definitely been the case for us. Yeah, we've been really pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I can just add that I think especially young people in Lithuania's case, they are more aware of how the whole economy works. And they understand that, well, it's not really just what they do is not they just give you money. They kind of give you more power to continue the work that you do. They understand that, okay, money is a means of, well, you need that to produce something. You cannot really work for free. So I think it's people aren't shy to talk about money. They understand that, okay, actually we kind of have this conversation about money because money is, well, it's not going anywhere. It exists in the world and we need to have a conversation about it. And I can maybe kind of relate to what was happening with the voting in Lithuania, that at certain time, well, there were people who thought that voting doesn't really change anything, that maybe we get all these same old politicians every time. But now voting became kind of thing like that's what a reasonable citizen have to do. And I think it's a similar thing with supporting journalism, that, well, that's what that's what you should do if you want to be like responsible citizen. Yeah, so that's the change that I'm spotting now in Lithuania.
Yeah, good to hear that. I hope that more people will agree with you that this is part of being a responsible citizen. David Goodman wants to know whether the funds that you raised through Patreon are free of any strings, meaning can you spend it on anything related to your production or podcast creation, etc.?
Yeah,
go ahead.
For anyone? Yeah, I think it's David, you're free to use your money on anything you want to spend it on. Buy yourself a beautiful new car if you want to. It's your money. And yes, you could spend it on anything related to your production. It is your earnings. I will add that it's fairly hard, or we have found it quite tricky. I'm sure Carolus is much better at this. We found it quite hard to get the money out of our Patreon. We leave our money there for like ages, and then like multiple thousands of euros will build up, and then we'll say, oh, okay, we really need to get this money out. How do we do it? And then Dominic spends multiple hours trying to get the money out, and it's very annoying. There are definitely things that you can set up to make it more regular. We've just been very bad at that. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, the money you raise, you need to check your local situation with regards to taxes that you might need to pay on it. But apart from that, in theory, you can spend the money on whatever you want to spend it on. Yeah,
definitely. And that's one of the beautiful things about Patreon, that usually when you apply for certain fund to get to get financial support, you need to spend a lot of time of like writing what you have actually done with that money. And sometimes it takes a lot of time, all this paperwork. And with Patreon, it's so direct. People give you money, and here it is. You can do whatever with it. And of course, it's monthly payment. So once you started doing that, you can continue for like, I don't know, 2 years, since until your card expires, and you don't have to do anything. So some people just leave that Patreon membership just like that, and you have to do something really, really bad, like just prove that you are unworthy of that money anymore for someone to make an extra effort and to cancel it, because canceling is an extra effort, and not that many people actually do that.
I will say, though, just to add to that, that not our podcast, but the different podcasts that I've worked on, they have a situation where, I don't know why, for whatever reason, they have a lot of people that will sign on to support you really quite generously for multiple months, and then they cut it off. I don't know if this is a phenomenon that you have seen on your end, Carolus, but at this other podcast that I worked on, there were people who were like, okay, I really like this podcast, but I don't have that much money. I will give them maybe 30 euros or $30 a month for like 4 months, and then I'm going to stop it. So that happens sometimes, and you have to, not be too anxious about thinking, oh God, why have they stopped supporting us? Is it because they hate us or something? There might be all kinds of reasons why people decide to stop supporting you. But Carolus is absolutely right. If we're talking about people who are giving, €2 a month, often they leave it running for ages, and that is excellent news for creators like us.
Yeah, what's happening in Lithuania is that there are so many people who have their own Patreon pages now. So some people who were supporting us, they decided, okay, you are doing pretty well. I will give my money to that new person who is doing something new because he or she needs support. And that's understandable. Sometimes people just write to us and kind of saying that, apologize for doing that, or like, I lost my job, I cannot really do that, cannot really support you now, but like no personal feelings attached to that. So yeah, people are really, they're so generous. I love that.
So after listening to you, I guess one of the conclusions is that there's no silver bullet to fund the podcast. Basically, you need, as the saying goes, you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. So you should look for different and diversify the revenue streams or the funding opportunities, etc. What was the most challenging thing in for both of you while trying to build this kind of diverse platform for finding funding?
For us, I'd say it was psychological. It was getting over this weird shame that we had attached to asking for money. We spent ages just thinking, oh, we should just do this for free, and not really questioning it. And it was really weird. And I don't know why we did feel like that. And eventually we got over it, and we launched it with like a lot of sort of self-consciousness and saying, okay, we're launching on Patreon. We're asking you for some money for this project that we do for hours and hours and hours every week for free on top of our jobs. And in the end, we just decided to feel okay about it. Actually, one thing that was quite interesting was that when we first launched Patreon, because of this weird shame that we had attached to it, we only mentioned it right at the end of every episode. And for whatever reason, a lot of people have stopped listening 5 minutes before the end, or perhaps 15 minutes before the end, because they're bored or because their train journey is finished, their bus ride is finished. So a lot of people weren't hearing that message. And one of the things that we did, one of my top tips for today would be to actually mention it a lot earlier in your episode, even right at the beginning, or maybe after 10 or 15 minutes. By the way, we're raising money so that we can continue making this podcast that I hope you like listening to. And that actually made a big difference for us in terms of actually getting more and more supporters. We saw a really sharp increase after we moved it from being this shameful little announcement at the end that we were very embarrassed to talk about, to something that we said fairly early on and with no shame attached to it.
Yeah, I'm laughing because we did the same thing. Also, our first Patreon announcements were at the very end of each episode, and statistics show that people tend to stop listening when they hear these final notes, and a lot of people just didn't hear about that. And psychological factor, I can definitely agree on that. Like, I used to work for public radio in Lithuania before, and a lot of our journalists have worked for like real jobs, let's say, right? And it was the idea to get money for that was so natural. But when we started with the podcast, with the idea that podcast can be your actual job, your actual career, rather than just your hobby, to kind of make this shift in your thinking, that took some time, and I'm glad that we did that. Podcasts it's not a hobby anymore, and I'm glad about that.
So for all those who are listening and thinking of starting their own podcast, so put your entrepreneurial hat on. Don't be ashamed to ask for money if you're doing good journalism or creating quality content. And do remember that little things matter, and put that Patreon tip at the beginning of the podcast, not at the end. Basically, our time is up for this session. Carolis, Katy, thank you so much for being with us. I think these both presentations were very insightful. And again, we might not want to talk about money and would want to focus only on the quality of the podcast we are producing, but they do matter. So it's worth discussing it. And with this actually concludes the public sessions in English of this festival. So I'll take a minute basically to thank all of those involved. Well, first of all, I just want to thank all the speakers and moderators who accepted to be part of this festival. It was incredible to have you and to hear all your talks and practical tips and suggestions. And I do think, well, we all miss the time when we could actually meet in person and share ideas. But at the moment, this is the best we could do. So I hope that the audience took some useful insights and some tips and inspiration. For the Bulgarians in the audience, please join us again at 6:20 when we'll talk about the podcasting scene in the country with some prominent Bulgarian podcasters. I also want to thank our interpreters, Mariela Simova and Elena Alexieva. Thanks for being with us all these 5 days and making sure that the Bulgarians in the audience who need a translation will have it. And I also want to thank Stefan Iliev and the entire team of OneTree who provided tech support for this festival. Also the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and America for Bulgaria Foundation. Thanks for supporting our efforts to improve the media freedom in the country and also organize events like this festival. And last but not least, I want to thank all the entire team of the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria. You see me on Zoom or Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching, but actually there are many people behind the camera, so to speak, who made this festival possible. Thanks for working weekends, answering emails at ungodly hours, and also for creating this supportive and creative environment where, again, we can make events like this possible. Thank you so much for those who are attending. I hope to see you in person or in Zoom sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.